You know, friend, there's something powerful about silence in a world that's always talking. Most folks these days, they fill every quiet moment with chatter, afraid of what they might hear if they actually listened. But out here in the frontier, silence speaks its own language. The rustle of grass before a storm, the hush that settles over a saloon when trouble walks through the door, the quiet that follows a man's last breath. This here's a story about a different kind of silence, the kind that comes not from fear or death, but from something deeper, something that can reach into the blackest hearts and find whatever light still flickers there. It's about a man who never spoke a word, yet said more than all the preachers, politicians, and peacemakers combined. They called him the Silent Preacher, though nobody knew his real name. He appeared in the Arizona Territory in the spring of '79, when the desert was painted with wildflowers and the air still carried winter's bite. Came walking out of the Sonoran Desert like he'd been born from the sand and sage, carrying nothing but a worn leather Bible, a wooden cross carved from mesquite, and a silence so complete it seemed to have weight. But this story is about what happened when that silence walked straight into hell itself. The Dragoon Mountains rise from the Arizona desert like the broken teeth of some ancient beast, all red rock and harsh shadows. In the spring of 1879, those mountains harbored secrets darker than their deepest canyons. Somewhere in that maze of stone and scrub, two of the most dangerous outlaw gangs in the territory had made their camps. The Torreon brothers, Miguel, Carlos, and the youngest, Eduardo, led a band of 30-odd desperados who'd been raising hell from Tucson to the Mexican border. Bank robberies, cattle rustling, stage hold-ups. If there was profit in it and law against it, the Torreons were willing to try it. Miguel, the eldest, was a man who'd learned his cruelty in Maximilian's army before the French got run out of Mexico. He wore his black hair long and his guns low, and men said he could put 3 bullets through a silver dollar at 50 paces. On the other side of the mountain, holed up in what had once been a mining camp called Perdition, was Dutch Keller's gang. Dutch himself was a big Germanic man with hands like ham hocks and a temper that burned hotter than a blacksmith's forge. He'd come west after deserting from the Union Army, bringing with him a knowledge of explosives that made him useful and dangerous in equal measure. His boys specialized in train robberies, using Dutch's expertise with dynamite to crack open Wells Fargo strongboxes like walnuts. Now you might think 2 gangs of cutthroats would find plenty of territory in Arizona to avoid each other, but the thing about evil men is they can't abide competition. The Torreons and Keller's bunch had been circling each other like wolves for months, each raid bringing them closer to open war. The spark that nearly lit the powder keg came on a Tuesday morning in late April. Eduardo Torreon, barely 19 and eager to prove himself, had taken 3 men to rob the stage running between Bisbee and Tombstone. What he didn't know was that Dutch Keller had his eye on the same prize. The shooting started at Apache Wells, where the stage stopped to water the horses. Eduardo's boys came in from the north, bandanas pulled up over their faces. Dutch's men approached from the south, having the same idea. When the smoke cleared, 2 of Eduardo's gang were dead, along with one of Dutch's men and the unfortunate stage driver who'd tried to reach for his shotgun. The strongbox, still locked, still sitting in the overturned coach, covered in blood and worthless to either side. Miguel Torreon took the news about as well as you'd expect. He sent word to Dutch Keller that he had 24 hours to deliver Eduardo's share of whatever had been in that strongbox, plus blood money for his dead men, or there'd be a reckoning that would turn the dragoons red. Dutch's reply was short and profane, delivered by a Mexican boy who rode hard from Perdition to the Torreon camp and lit out again before anyone could ask questions. The message was carved into a piece of pine board: "Come and take it." By sunset that day, both gangs were cleaning their guns and checking their ammunition. By morning, the mountains would run red with blood. But sometimes, when darkness seems certain, light appears from the most unexpected places. The silent preacher walked into the Torreon camp just as the sun was touching the western peaks. Nobody heard him coming, not the sentries, not the horses, not even the camp dogs that should have raised hell at a stranger's approach. One moment, the outlaws were gathered around their fire, talking war and violence, and the next moment he was simply there among them, like he'd materialized from the shadows themselves. He was a tall man, lean as a fence post, with brown hair going grey at the temples, and eyes the colour of winter sky. His face was weathered but not hard, marked by sun and wind but not by cruelty. He wore simple clothes, black wool pants, a white cotton shirt, and a dark coat that had seen better days. No gun belt, no badge, no visible weapon of any kind, just that leather Bible tucked under one arm and the mesquite cross hanging from a cord around his neck. The outlaws stared at him like they'd seen a ghost. Miguel Torreon was the first to find his voice. "Who the hell are you, and how did you get past my guards?" The silent preacher looked at Miguel for a long moment, those winter eyes taking in everything, the anger, the grief for his dead men, the fear he tried to hide behind bluster. Then he simply opened his Bible and pointed to a passage, holding the book so the firelight fell across the page. Miguel squinted at the words, his English better than most realized. "Blessed are the peacemakers," he read aloud, his voice thick with accent and disbelief, "for they shall be called the children of God." "Mierda," spat Carlos, Miguel's middle brother. "We got us a sky pilot, a preacher man come to save our souls." His laugh was ugly, full of edges. "You picked a bad time for salvation, Padre. We got killing to do come morning." The silent preacher closed his Bible and looked around the camp, meeting the eyes of every man there. 30-odd hard cases, killers and thieves, who'd been running from the law so long they'd forgotten what honest work looked like. Men who'd shot down marshals and hanged ranchers and done things in the dark that would make the devil himself look away. But he didn't flinch, didn't back down, didn't show fear or disgust or judgment. He just looked at them with those winter eyes, and somehow God knows how they found themselves looking back. "Can you even talk, preacher?" asked a scarred gunman called Tres Dedos, named for the 3 fingers he'd lost to a dynamite accident. "Or did the Apaches cut out your tongue?" The silent preacher opened his mouth and pointed inside, letting them see. His tongue was there, whole and unharmed. He could speak if he chose to. He simply didn't. "Took a vow of silence," Miguel said slowly, understanding dawning in his dark eyes. "Like them monks in the old country. My grandmother, she told stories about such men." The silent preacher nodded once, slowly. Then he did something that made every gun hand in that camp reach for their iron. He walked to the fire and sat down cross-legged beside it, calm as Sunday morning. "You got brass, I'll give you that," Miguel said. "But brass don't stop bullets, Padre, and come morning, we're riding to war with Dutch Keller. You best move along before you get caught in the crossfire." The silent preacher shook his head, not defiant but sad, like he was grieving for something that hadn't happened yet. Eduardo, the youngest Torreon, spoke up for the first time. "Maybe he's got a point, Miguel. Maybe there's been enough killing." The slap that Miguel dealt his brother rang across the camp like a gunshot. Eduardo's head snapped back, blood trickling from his split lip. "Enough killing." Miguel's voice was deadly quiet. "Dutch Keller murdered 2 of our men, 2 of our family, and you want to talk about enough killing?" "I want to talk about staying alive." Eduardo shot back, his young face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Every man we lose makes us weaker. And for what? Pride. Some strongbox that might have held $50 or $5,000. We don't even know what was in it." "We know what it represents," Carlos said coldly. "Respect, fear. Let Dutch Keller think he can gun down Torreon men without consequence, and every 2-bit pistolero from here to Mexico will figure he can take a shot at us." The argument went on, voices rising, tempers fraying like old rope, and through it all, the silent preacher sat by the fire, his presence like a still point in a turning world. He didn't speak, didn't gesture, didn't interfere. He just was. But his silence was different from the desert quiet or the hush before a storm. This was a listening silence, patient and deep, the kind of silence that invites honesty, that makes a man look inside himself and see what's really there. One by one, the voices died away. One by one, the outlaws found themselves looking at this strange preacher who'd walked uninvited into their camp and made himself at home by their fire, made himself part of their circle without saying a word. "What do you want from us?" Miguel asked finally, his voice hoarse from shouting. The silent preacher reached into his coat and pulled out a piece of paper, good paper, the kind used for legal documents and letters from back east. He handed it to Miguel, who unfolded it carefully. It was a drawing, done in charcoal with a skilled hand. It showed a cemetery on a hillside, row upon row of wooden crosses stretching toward the horizon. At the bottom, in careful script, were the words, "The Harvest of Hatred." Miguel stared at the drawing for a long time, his brothers peering over his shoulder. Around the camp, men shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware of the weight of their guns, the coldness of the metal against their skin. "You think we're all going to die tomorrow," Miguel said. It wasn't a question. The silent preacher didn't nod or shake his head. He simply took the drawing back, folded it carefully, and returned it to his coat. Then he stood, brushed dust from his pants, and walked to the edge of the firelight. For a moment, it seemed he would leave as mysteriously as he'd come, but instead he turned back and pointed to himself, then to the mountain trail that led toward Perdition and Dutch Keller's camp. The message was clear as sunrise. "I'm going to them next." "Madre de Dios," whispered Eduardo. "He's going to try to stop this thing, a mute preacher against two gangs of killers." Miguel was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. When he finally looked up, his face was troubled. "Carlos," he said, "double the sentries. I want to know if that preacher comes back. And if Dutch Keller's boys try anything before dawn, I want to know about it while there's still time to die fighting instead of sleeping." As the silent preacher walked into the darkness, heading up the mountain trail toward Perdition, more than one hard case found himself wondering about the man's courage, or maybe his sanity. But courage and sanity, out here in the territory, sometimes looked exactly the same. The trail from the Torreon camp to Perdition was treacherous in daylight, near suicidal at night. It wound up through stands of prickly pear and cholla, across washouts where flash floods had carved deep gullies in the red earth. A man could break his neck in a dozen different ways, or worse, end up buzzard bait in some hidden canyon where his bones wouldn't be found until the next hard rain. But the silent preacher climbed that trail like he'd walked it 100 times before. His feet found solid ground in the darkness, avoided the loose stones that would have sent a normal man tumbling. Maybe it was divine providence. Maybe it was just the kind of mountain sense a man develops when he's spent enough time in high country. Either way, he reached Perdition as the moon was setting behind the western peaks. Perdition had been a silver mining camp once, back when men still believed the mountains would make them rich instead of dead. Now it was a ghost town with teeth, empty buildings and broken dreams, populated by the kind of men who'd given up on honest prosperity and decided to take what they needed from those who'd been luckier or smarter. Dutch Keller's gang had made camp in what used to be the assay office, a stone building with thick walls and good lines of sight. They'd posted guards, of course, hard men with good ears and itchy trigger fingers. But somehow, and nobody could ever explain how, the silent preacher walked right past them all. Dutch himself was sitting at a table made from 2 sawhorses and a piece of pine planking, cleaning his Remington revolver by lamplight. He was a big man, thick through the chest and shoulders, with yellow hair and pale eyes that missed nothing. Those eyes were the first thing to spot the preacher standing quietly in the doorway. "Well, I'll be damned," Dutch said, his voice carrying the faint accent of his homeland. "Boys, we got ourselves a visitor." 20-odd men turned to stare, hands moving instinctively toward their weapons. But something in the silent preacher's bearing, maybe the calm in his winter eyes, Maybe the simple way he stood with empty hands kept them from drawing iron. "You got a death wish, preacher man?" Dutch asked, setting down his cleaning rag. Because walking into an outlaw camp uninvited is usually the last thing a fellow does. The silent preacher stepped into the lamplight, and Dutch could see him clearly for the first time. The weathered face, the graying hair, the Bible tucked under his arm. But it was the eyes that held Dutch's attention, eyes that seemed to see too much, understand too much. "Cat got your tongue?" asked a lean gunman called Snake Morrison, grinning to show teeth stained yellow from tobacco. "Or maybe the Apaches got it for you." The silent preacher opened his mouth, letting them see his intact tongue, just as he'd done in the Torreon camp. Then he pointed to his throat and shook his head, the gesture somehow conveying volumes about choice and sacrifice, and things that went deeper than mere words. "Took a vow," Dutch said slowly. "I heard of such things, monks and such, back in the old country." He leaned back in his chair, studying the preacher with new interest. "Question is, what's a silent monk doing in the middle of a war zone?" The silent preacher reached into his coat, slowly, carefully, keeping his movements visible, and pulled out another piece of paper. This one he handed to Dutch, who unfolded it with thick fingers. It was the same drawing he'd shown Miguel, the hillside cemetery, the endless rows of crosses, the harvest of hatred. But this time, the silent preacher had added something. At the bottom of the page, in that same careful script, were names. Dutch recognized some of them, his own men, boys he'd ridden with for years, and mixed in among them the names of the Torreon gang. "You think we're all going to die tomorrow," Dutch said, echoing Miguel's words from hours earlier. The silent preacher took the paper back, but he didn't put it away immediately. Instead, he pointed to each name in turn, then to the men sitting around the stone room, making sure Dutch understood that these weren't just names on paper. They were real people, with real lives that would end real hard if the shooting started. "Maybe some of us will die," Dutch admitted, "but not all, and those that live, well, they'll have learned not to mess with Dutch Keller's boys." The silent preacher shook his head sadly, like he was grieving for Dutch's blindness as much as for the men who would die. Then he did something unexpected. He knelt down beside Dutch's chair, close enough that the big outlaw could have broken his neck with one swing of his massive fists. But Dutch didn't move. Something in the preacher's manner, in the weight of his silence, held him still. The silent preacher opened his Bible to a specific passage and held it where Dutch could read it. The lamplight flickered across the page as Dutch squinted at the words. "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord," Dutch read aloud, his voice uncertain. "I will repay." The silent preacher turned the page, pointed to another passage. "But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you." Dutch's laugh was harsh, bitter. "Pretty words, preacher, but they don't mean much out here. You love your enemies in this country, you end up feeding buzzards." The silent preacher closed the Bible, but he didn't stand up. Instead, he reached into his coat again and pulled out something that made every man in that room suck in his breath. It was a photograph, faded and creased from handling. It showed a woman and a small boy, maybe 5 years old, standing in front of a farmhouse somewhere back east. The woman was pretty in a tired way, with worry lines around her eyes. The boy had Dutch's yellow hair and pale eyes. "Where did you get this?" Dutch's voice was deadly quiet, more dangerous than shouting. The silent preacher pointed to Dutch, then to his own heart. Then he mammoned writing, and Dutch understood. Someone had written to the preacher about Dutch Keller, someone who knew about the wife and son he'd left behind when he'd deserted from the army, when he'd chosen the outlaw trail over going home to face what he'd done in the war. "They're probably dead by now," Dutch said roughly. "Been 8 years since I seen them, 8 years since I sent any money." The silent preacher shook his head and pointed to the photograph again. "Recent," his gesture said. "This was taken recently." Dutch stared at the picture for a long time, his hands trembling slightly as he held it up to the lamplight. Around the room, his men shuffled uncomfortably. They'd followed Dutch Keller because he was hard, because he never showed weakness, never let sentiment cloud his judgment. But now their leader was staring at a photograph of his family like it might disappear if he blinked. "What do you want from me?" Dutch asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The silent preacher stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkness where the Torreon gang waited for dawn. Then he turned back and pointed to Dutch, to himself, and to the trail that led down the mountain. "You want me to go with you," Dutch said, "to talk to Miguel Torreon?" The silent preacher nodded. "That's suicide," Snake Morrison said from across the room. "Miguel Torreon would gun you down before you got close enough to speak, and us with you, if we're fool enough to ride along." The silent preacher walked back to Dutch and opened his Bible again, this time to a passage he'd marked with a ribbon. Dutch read it silently, his lips moving slightly as he worked through the unfamiliar words. "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends," Dutch read aloud finally. The silent preacher closed the Bible and tucked it under his arm. Then he walked to the door, pausing only to look back at Dutch with those winter eyes that seemed to see straight through to a man's soul. The message was clear. "I'm going back down that mountain, with you or without you. I'm going to try to stop this war, even if it kills me, because that's what love demands, not the easy kind of love that costs nothing, but the hard kind that requires everything." Dutch looked around the room at his men, at the hard faces and cold eyes and ready guns. Then he looked at the photograph in his hands, at the woman who'd waited 8 years for a man who might never come home, at the boy who'd grown up without a father. "Damn you, preacher," he said finally. "Damn you for making this so hard." But he was already reaching for his hat. Outside, the eastern sky was beginning to show the faintest hint of grey. Dawn was coming, and with it, the moment when men would have to choose between hatred and hope. The silent preacher waited in the darkness, patient as stone, while Dutch Keller wrestled with 8 years of running, 8 years of choices that had brought him to this place and this moment. Behind him, his men muttered and argued, but Dutch barely heard them. He was remembering a farm in Illinois, a woman's laugh, a little boy who used to follow him around the fields like a devoted puppy. He was remembering the man he'd been before the war changed him, before he'd learned that killing could be easy, and that easy money came at the hardest price of all. "I must be losing my mind," Dutch said to the darkness. But he was already strapping on his gun belt. The sun was rising behind the Dragoon Mountains when Dutch Keller and the silent preacher walked into the Torreon camp together. They came alone despite the protests of both gangs. Dutch's men thought he'd lost his mind, riding down to parley with enemies who'd killed one of their own. The Torreons couldn't believe Miguel would agree to meet with the man who'd started this whole blood feud. But here they were, standing in the grey morning light, while 30-odd gunmen from each side watched from carefully chosen positions among the rocks and scrub. The slightest wrong move, the smallest misunderstanding, and the mountains would erupt in gunfire that wouldn't stop until one side or the other was wiped out completely. Miguel Torreon stood near his morning fire, his brothers flanking him like dark angels. He was dressed for war, leather and steel, his guns cleaned and loaded, his face set in lines that might have been carved from granite. Dutch Keller looked no different from any other day, but those who knew him could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his pale eyes never stopped moving, cataloguing threats and calculating odds. Between them stood the silent preacher, still carrying nothing but his Bible and his mesquite cross, still speaking no words, but somehow commanding attention from every man present. So Miguel said, his accent thick with emotion barely held in check, "The great Dutch Keller comes to surrender, to beg forgiveness for the blood of my men." "I come to talk," Dutch replied, his voice steady, "to see if there's a way out of this that doesn't end with half of us feeding buzzards." "There is a way," Carlos, Torreon said, his hand resting on his gun butt. "You and your boys ride out of the territory. Don't come back. Leave us your share of whatever you stole this year, plus blood money for our dead. Do that, and maybe we let you live." Dutch's laugh was short and bitter. "And maybe pigs will sprout wings and fly. I got a better idea. You boys pack up and head for Mexico. Find some nice hacienda to rob, some fat don to kidnap. Leave Arizona to men who know how to use it." The insult hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire. Hands moved toward guns. Men shifted position, looking for cover. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, ready to tip either way. That's when the silent preacher stepped forward. He walked to the exact center of the space between the two groups, a spot that put him in perfect range of every gun present. Then he did something that made every hard case present hold his breath. He knelt down and began to clear away rocks and debris, using his bare hands to smooth a patch of earth about 6 feet square. When he was satisfied, he stood and looked at Miguel, then at Dutch, his winter eyes holding a question. "What's he doing?" Eduardo whispered to his oldest brother. Miguel shook his head, but he was watching the silent preacher with the intensity of a man trying to solve a puzzle that might save his life. The silent preacher opened his Bible and found a passage, holding it so both leaders could see, but instead of waiting for them to read it aloud, he did something unprecedented. He began to write in the dirt. Not words at first, but pictures. Simple drawings that any man could understand, regardless of education or language. He drew 2 groups of stick figures facing each other, guns raised. Then he drew what would happen next. Bodies falling, blood soaking into the earth, buzzards circling overhead. But that wasn't the end of his story. Below the scene of carnage, he drew something else. The same 2 groups of men, but this time they were working together, building something. A town maybe, or a ranch. Protecting a wagon train, fighting off Apache raiders who threatened settlers and outlaws alike. When he was finished with the pictures, the silent preacher began to write words in the dirt. Slowly, carefully, in letters large enough for everyone to read. "There is another way." Miguel stepped closer, studying the drawings and words. "What other way?" he demanded. "Speak, damn you." The silent preacher looked at him with infinite sadness, then pointed to his throat and shook his head. He could not speak, would not speak, but he could write. He knelt again and added more words to his message. "The law is coming. Marshals, cavalry. They know about perdition. They know about your camps." A murmur ran through both groups. Dutch stepped forward, his face grim. "How do you know this?" The silent preacher wrote again. "I came from Torreon. They are gathering forces. You have maybe 2 days before they move." "All the more reason to settle this now," Miguel said coldly. "Kill Dutch and his boys, take their supplies, head for Mexico before the bluecoats arrive." But Eduardo was studying the drawings in the dirt with the intensity of a man seeing revelation. "Or," he said quietly, "we could do what the preacher suggests. Work together, help each other disappear before the law arrives." "Work together," Carlos spat. "With the men who killed our hermanos?" The silent preacher stood and walked to Carlos, stopping just out of arm's reach. He looked the middle Torreon brother in the eye for a long moment, then reached into his coat. What he pulled out this time wasn't a photograph or a drawing. It was a letter, written on expensive paper in a woman's flowing script. He handed it to Carlos, who opened it with suspicion. As Carlos read, his face went white, then red, then white again. His hands shook so badly he nearly dropped the letter. "What is it?" Miguel demanded. It's from Rosa," Carlos whispered. "My Rosa, in Hermosillo. She says she's with child. My child. She wants me to come home, to marry her proper before the baby comes." The letter passed from hand to hand through the Torreon gang. Men who'd forgotten they had hearts found themselves remembering what it felt like to hope for something better than the outlaw trail. Dutch watched this with narrowed eyes. "Preacher," he said carefully, "you got something for me too." The silent preacher nodded and produced another letter. This one was written on cheaper paper, in the careful handwriting of someone not entirely comfortable with a pen. Dutch read it silently, his face revealing nothing. But when he was finished, he folded the letter carefully and put it in his shirt pocket, right over his heart. "My boy," he said finally. "He's 12 now, wrote this himself, says he's been asking about his pa, wondering when I'm coming home." Silence settled over the assembled outlaws like morning mist. These hard men, these killers and thieves, found themselves thinking about things they'd tried to forget, families left behind, promises broken, roads not taken. The silent preacher knelt in the dirt one more time and wrote, "You are more than what you have become." He drew a line under the words, emphasizing them. Then he wrote again, "It is not too late to choose differently." Miguel stared at the message for a long time. When he finally looked up, his dark eyes held a pain that went deeper than any bullet wound. "You think it's that simple?" he asked. "You think we can just walk away? Forget the blood, forget the hatred, become different men because a mute preacher tells us to?" The silent preacher erased everything he'd written in the dirt, smoothing the earth clean. Then he wrote just 2 words, "Faith, hope," and below that, in letters twice as large, "Love." Dutch Keller laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Love," he said. "Christ, preacher, you really are touched in the head. There ain't no love in this business, just fear and greed and the gun on your hip." The silent preacher stood and walked to Dutch's horse, which was ground-reined nearby. From the saddlebags he pulled out the photograph Dutch had been looking at the night before, the picture of his wife and son. He held it up so everyone could see, then placed it gently in the dirt next to the word love. Then he went to Miguel and held out his hand, waiting. "What do you want?" Miguel asked. The silent preacher mimed pulling something from his pocket, something small and precious. He waited, patient as stone, until understanding dawned in Miguel's eyes. Slowly, reluctantly, Miguel reached into his vest and pulled out a small silver locket. He opened it to reveal a tiny painted portrait of a young woman with dark hair and laughing eyes. "Isabella," he whispered. "She died of fever 3 years ago, in Sonora." The silent preacher placed the locket in the dirt next to Dutch's photograph. Then he looked around the assembled men, his gaze touching each face, asking the same silent question. One by one they came forward. Eduardo with a ribbon that had belonged to a girl in Santa Fe. Carlos with a rosary his mother had given him before he'd ridden north to seek his fortune. Dutch's men contributed their own tokens, letters from home, photographs, small treasures that connected them to the men they'd been before they'd chosen the outlaw trail. When they were finished, the patch of cleared earth looked like a shrine. Dozens of small items, each representing a life unlived, a choice unmade, a road not taken. The silent preacher stood in the center of it all and opened his Bible one final time. He found the passage he was looking for and held the book so everyone could see. But instead of asking someone else to read, he did something that made every man present step backward in amazement. He spoke. His voice was rusty from disuse, barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly in the mountain air. "Behold, I make all things new," he read, each word carefully pronounced, weighted with years of accumulated silence. "The former things are passed away." The sound of his voice hit the assembled outlaws like a physical blow. This man, who'd taken a vow of silence, who'd communicated only through gestures and written words, had broken that vow for them. "Why?" Miguel asked, his own voice hoarse with emotion. "Why break your silence now?" The silent preacher, who was silent no longer, closed his Bible and looked around at the faces surrounding him. Hardened faces, scarred by violence and marked by choices that had led them far from home. "Because," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word, Some things are worth breaking silence for. Some truths are too important to leave unspoken. He gestured to the shrine they'd created, to the photographs and letters and small treasures that represented everything they'd given up for the outlaw life. "You think you're too far gone," he continued, "too stained by blood, too marked by violence to ever find your way back to the light. But you're wrong. Every one of you has someone waiting, someone hoping, someone who remembers the man you were before you became the man you are." Dutch picked up his photograph, studying the faces of his wife and son. "Easy words, preacher. But the law don't care about our good intentions. There's paper out on every man here. Rewards that would make a poor farmer rich for life." "Then don't go back to where the law is looking for you," the preacher replied. "Go forward. Find new places, new names, new lives. Help each other disappear instead of killing each other. Use the skills that made you dangerous outlaws to become something else entirely." "And if we meet again someday?" Miguel asked. "If our paths cross when memory has dimmed and old grudges seem fresh again?" The preacher knelt and gathered up all the photographs and letters and small treasures. He handed them back to their owners, one by one, looking each man in the eye as he did so. "Then you'll remember this moment," he said simply. "You'll remember that you chose to be more than your worst instincts. You'll remember that love is stronger than hatred, that hope is more powerful than vengeance." He stood and brushed dust from his knees, looking suddenly smaller, more fragile. The act of breaking his long silence had cost him something, aged him visibly. "The cavalry will be here tomorrow, maybe the day after," he said. "If you're smart, you'll be long gone by then. If you're wise, you'll go in different directions and help each other stay gone." Miguel looked at Dutch, measuring the man who'd been his enemy for so long. Slowly, carefully, he extended his hand. Dutch stared at it for a moment, that stretched like eternity. Then, with visible effort, he reached out and clasped Miguel's hand in his own. The handshake lasted only seconds, but it felt like the earth shifting beneath their feet. "We'll head south," Miguel said, "towards Sonora. Give you boys time to clear out north." Dutch nodded slowly. "Fair enough. We'll take the Utah Trail, maybe swing up toward Colorado territory. Plenty of places to lose ourselves in those mountains." Eduardo stepped forward, young face serious beyond his years. "What about the blood between us? The men who died?" The preacher reached into his coat one last time and pulled out a small cloth bag. From it, he poured a handful of seeds into his palm, wildflower seeds gathered from the desert in spring bloom. He scattered them over the shrine they'd created, over the photographs and letters and tokens of lives half-lived. Then he knelt and covered the seeds with dirt, patting the earth gently with his hands. "Plant hope where hatred grew," he said simply. "Let something beautiful grow from the soil that was watered with blood." The gangs began to break up then, men gathering their gear with the quiet efficiency of those who'd spent their lives ready to move at a moment's notice. But there was something different in their manner, less of the hard-edged wariness that had marked them as outlaws, more of the purposeful movement of men with places to go and reasons to get there. Carlos Torreon approached the preacher as the sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the camp. "Father," he said, for that's what the man had become in the space of a few hours, a father to lost souls who'd forgotten they had any family left. "How did you know? About Rosa? About the letters? About the cavalry coming?" The preacher smiled, and for the first time since he'd appeared in their lives, he looked genuinely peaceful. "I've been walking these territories for 7 years," he said, "carrying letters, messages, news between towns and camps, and lonely places where people have no other way to reach each other. I know where the marshal posts his men, know which trails the cavalry rides, know which mothers are still writing letters to sons they haven't seen in years." He touched the cross at his throat, worn smooth by handling. "I took a vow of silence, not because I had nothing to say, but because I learned that sometimes the most important things can't be spoken. They have to be lived. demonstrated, shown by example. Dutch approached, leading his horse, ready to ride. And if this don't work, if some of the boys can't let go of the hate, come looking for revenge down the road, then you'll deal with that when it comes, the preacher said. But you'll deal with it as better men than you were this morning, and that has to count for something. Miguel was the last to leave, his brothers and his men already mounted and waiting at the edge of camp. He stood for a moment, looking at the patch of earth where they'd buried their shrine, where wildflower seeds were already beginning to take root in the desert soil. "Will we see you again?" he asked. The preacher shouldered his Bible and adjusted his worn coat. "I'll be walking these mountains and deserts as long as there are people who need letters carried, messages delivered, peace brokered between those who've forgotten how to talk to each other." He paused, looking out over the Dragoon Mountains where the morning sun was burning off the last of the night's shadows. "Look for wildflowers next spring," he said. "If they bloom here, you'll know the peace held." And with that, he turned and walked away, not north or south with either group of outlaws, but west toward the rising sun, his figure growing smaller and smaller until he seemed to merge with the desert light itself. Now, friend, you might be wondering how this story ends. Did the peace hold? Did those hard men find their way back to the people they'd left behind? Did wildflowers bloom where hatred had once taken root? Well, I can tell you this much. The cavalry did come, just as the preacher had warned. 2 days later, a full company of bluecoats swept through the dragoons, looking for the outlaw gangs that had been raising hell throughout the territory. They found empty camps, cold fires, and not a single desperado to arrest. The official report stated that the criminals had apparently scattered, probably fled to Mexico or parts unknown. Case closed, bounties unclaimed, peace restored to the region. But that's the official story. The real story, well, that takes a little longer to tell. 3 years later, a farmer named Bill Kendrick moved his family to a spread near Denver, Colorado. He was a quiet man, good with horses and better with his hands, who never talked much about where he'd come from or what he'd done before he'd taken up farming. His wife and boy seemed happy enough, and neighbors noted that Kendrick had a peculiar habit of sending money south to Mexico every few months, helping family, he said, though he didn't look like a man with Mexican relations. Around the same time, a man calling himself Carlos Herrera opened a small store in the town of Hermosillo, in Sonora. He specialized in supplies for travelers and miners, spoke excellent English, and was known for his fair dealing and his beautiful wife Rosa. Their first child, a son, was born healthy and strong, and Herrera was heard to say he'd never been so proud of anything in his life. His brother Miguel found work as a guide for rich Eastern folks who wanted to see the real West without actually encountering anything dangerous. He was good at the job, knew the country like the back of his hand, could read sign and weather, and had an uncanny ability to steer his parties away from any real trouble. He never married, but he carried a silver locket that contained the picture of a young woman, and sometimes, when he thought no one was looking, he'd take it out and look at it for a long time. Eduardo, the youngest, surprised everyone by taking up teaching. He ended up in a small town in New Mexico territory, helping Mexican and Indian children learn to read and write English. He said education was the key to understanding between peoples, though he never explained how he'd come to that particular philosophy. And Dutch Keller? Well, there's no official record of what happened to him, but there are stories, unconfirmed but persistent, about a big German fellow who showed up at a farm in Illinois one autumn day, thin as a rail and scarred by years of hard living, asking if a woman named Martha Keller still lived there. The reunion, if it happened, was said to be something to see. As for the silent preacher himself, sightings of him continued throughout the territory for years afterward. A tall man with winter eyes, carrying letters and messages, appearing wherever there was trouble between folks who'd forgotten how to talk to each other. Sometimes he spoke, sometimes he didn't, but he always seemed to know just what was needed to help people remember their better angels. And every spring, without fail, wildflowers bloomed in a particular spot in the Dragoon Mountains. Desert marigolds and lupins, poppies and fairy dusters, growing thick and bright in soil that had once been watered with blood and hatred. The locals started calling it Peace Meadow, though none of them could quite remember why. You see, friend, that's the thing about peace. It don't come from laws or treaties or armies. It comes from individual hearts, individual choices, individual moments when people decide to be better than their worst instincts. It comes from understanding that every enemy was somebody's son, somebody's father, somebody's hope for the future. The silent preacher knew something that most folks never learn, that the deepest truths can't be shouted or legislated or forced on people. They have to be planted like seeds, in the quiet spaces between heartbeats, in the silence between words, in the moment when a man looks at his enemy and sees himself looking back. Sometimes, the most powerful thing a person can do is simply show up, be present, listen to the silence beneath the shouting, and hear what people are really trying to say. Hold space for folks to remember who they used to be, who they might become again if given the chance. And sometimes, just sometimes, that's enough to change everything. The next time you find yourself facing someone you think you hate, someone you're certain can't be reasoned with or redeemed, remember the silent preacher. Remember that he walked into a camp full of killers with nothing but faith and a worn Bible, and walked out with the promise of peace. Remember that love really is stronger than hatred, that hope really can overcome vengeance, that the shortest distance between enemies is often a moment of genuine understanding. Remember that every person carries within them both the capacity for great evil and great good, and that which one they choose often depends on whether someone believes the good is still there to be found. And if you ever find yourself in the Arizona desert in springtime, look for a place where wildflowers grow especially thick and bright. Sit there for a spell, in the quiet, and listen. You might just hear the echo of a silence that changed the world.